I was asked to provide some historical context for understanding this current explosion of popular mobilization and protest, to frame this current moment in the aftermath of 17 years of dictatorship, 16 years of dictatorship, almost 30 years of formal democracy, neoliberal economic reforms, explosive economic growth, and extreme income inequality. So I want to approach this topic through the dynamic between popular mobilization and demobilization, and different theories of state responsibility that I think will help us understand what's going on right now. So if there's time during the question and answer session, I'd also like us as a group to consider the ways in which historical memory is currently being invoked by the protesters to make sense of their actions and build support for the movement in relationship to their understanding of the long history of repression that they're working in the wake of. All right, so on November 1970, Salvador Allende Gossens was inaugurated as the president of Chile and Latin America's first democratically elected socialist head of state. Allende was a Marxist physician, former Minister of Health, and was one of the founders of Chile's Socialist Party. He believed in a democratic route to democratic socialism, and his Unidad Popular coalition of socialists, communists, and left Christian Democrats had a strong base of support among urban and rural working class. So this support was deepened by a series of popular economic policies, including wage increases, price controls on basic goods, and the expropriation of US-owned copper mines in Chile, and of course copper being a central sector of the Chilean economy. But this was not simply a top-down process of reform, and that's key for understanding really this broader process. Workers, peasants, and the urban poor took advantage of this period of reform, this era of social change, to press their demands for greater workplace democracy, for land for peasants, and for better wages and working conditions. Peasants seized lands from latifundios, these extremely large tracts of land that were owned by a tiny segment of the rural elite class, and demanded that the government legalize the peasant actions through formal expropriation. By 1971, more than 100 of these land seizures was happening every month. So you see this was like this period of massive bottom-up action as well as top-down reform. Similarly, in the cities, mobilized workers pressed the government to socialize factories in key economic sectors, and increasingly took matters into their own hands by taking over the factories themselves and running them through participatory democratic structures. Mobilized urban and rural workers therefore helped radicalize the Allende presidency as reforms fed into popular economic demands for a more radical restructuring of the Chilean economy. But while working class support was deep, so was opposition to the Allende reforms among the landed oligarchy, multinational corporations, domestic corporations, right-wing sectors of the media, and of course by US officials who tended to oppose socialist leaders regardless of the fact that they might have been democratically elected. As Henry Kissinger famously said, as when he was Secretary of State of the United States under the Nixon administration, the United States, he said, quote, I don't see why we should have to stand by and let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. For the Chilean right, this period of social reform, and especially the popular mobilization that it helped spur, seemed an existential threat. The image of peasants claiming lands and workers taking over factories seemed to them to represent chaos, the inversion of a social order based on clear social hierarchy. Political polarization increased rapidly. And as the Allende government struggled to rein in this popular mobilization from below, the rapid change and seeming chaos of the period drove the middle classes and elite further to the right. Finally, on September 11th, 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup that ousted Salvador Allende, ended Latin America's longest-lasting democracy, the longest-running democracy in Latin American history, and installed a 16-year dictatorship that was characterized by political violence, authoritarianism, and the implementation of Latin America's first experiment in neoliberal economic reform. So while Chileans interpreted the coup rather differently depending on their class and political orientation, the results of the coup were tragic for Allende supporters, for those in the labor movement, and for those who tried to organize domestic opposition to the dictatorship. Over the next 16 years, but particularly in the first few years, between 28,000 and 50,000 Chileans were detained and tortured, And of those, more than 3,000 were disappeared by the government, murdered without trial, without acknowledging that the victim had even been detained by the government. One of the main effects of the detentions, tortures, and disappearances, and one I think that's too often left out of discussions of political violence during the Cold War, was how it helped demobilize Chilean society. Political parties aligned with the labor movement were crushed. Unions were targeted for repression, and labor militants were regularly arrested, tortured, and disappeared. The labor movement was gutted. So collective bargaining, strikes, and union elections were all made illegal. And state-led labor mediation boards were also dismantled. And the government decreed a new law that allowed it to remove labor union leaders at will. So in the face of government repression and anti-union policies, the remaining unions were too weak to adequately protect worker interests. And as a result, union membership gradually diminished. Workers' councils, peasant councils, and neighborhood councils, whose participatory democratic structures facilitated popular demands for more radical change during the Allende years, were all dismantled. The violence and repression put to an end this period of popular mobilization and paved the way for the complete reversal of Allende's economic policies. By the middle of the 1970s, Pinochet was free to implement a wide-ranging experiment in neoliberal economic reforms, dramatically reducing the size of the state through privatization and a retreat from social welfare policies of the past, dating back to the populist period of the mid-20th century. Reducing tariffs and ending state support for local industry, and dramatically curtailing any state regulation of the economy. And I think here it's important for us to think about how the neoliberal policies of the Pinochet dictatorship represented a completely different theory of state responsibility from the model shared by Latin American populists and the government of Salvador Allende. Allende's Popular Unity Party platform had an expansive vision of state responsibility for the poor that included guaranteed employment and better wages and protections for workers, major expansions in public health, in housing and education, and a pint of milk for every child to ensure that all Chileans could grow up healthy. The idea really seems to be that the government had a responsibility to intervene in the economy, to make sure that everyone had a chance, to provide a more level playing field for all Chileans. At its root was this idea that democracy required a degree of equality, and that the rights of citizens included the social right to health care, to employment, and to housing. For those on the margins of society, for the very poor and the oldest and the youngest, the state would guarantee these rights. So the neoliberal economic vision obviously represented a much more reduced vision of state responsibility. Instead of a state regulating the economy, the market would regulate society. Most nationalized enterprises were quickly reprivatized, and agrarian reform measures were rolled back. Education and healthcare were privatized. Workers would have little control over their wages or working conditions, and pensions were slashed. The result in terms of pure economic growth were quite impressive. GDP growth was upwards of 8% per year by the late 1970s, and certain economic sectors boomed. But with rising growth came vastly increased economic inequality. The Chilean economic miracle, as it was called, disproportionately benefited the wealthy. And for a while, consistent economic growth protected the Pinochet regime, but the surprising results of a 1989 national plebiscite ended 16 years of dictatorship and ushered in a new era of formal electoral democracy. But what is important here, I think, is that despite this democratic opening, the terms of state responsibility for the poor largely remains unchanged from the dictatorship. The economic model that was made possible by state repression, that had as its precondition state repression and popular demobilization, remained the economic status quo throughout the post-dictatorship period, even as other countries in Latin America increasingly rejected the neoliberal model. And even as Chileans came to increasingly confront the violence of the early Pinochet years, ending years of impunity for those that had committed torture or who had ordered the murder of suspected dissidents, the terms of the memory debate continued to revolve largely around accountability for human rights violations, sidestepping the fact that one of the central effects of these human rights violations was the continued disavowal of social rights in Chile. But as we're seeing today, decades later, the very economic policies that for so long were seen as ensuring economic growth and political stability are increasingly recognized as the cause of vast inequality and growing popular unrest. As protesters are increasingly declaring, Chile is waking up to the neoliberal legacies of the dictatorship. Decades of demobilization are giving way to mass mobilization, and demands for state intervention in the economy, for economic equality as a precondition for true democracy, are once again shaping popular politics. Thank you.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you for having me. So I would like to, through a few figures and a few ideas, to challenge the idea of the economic miracle. One could do it in challenging some of the figures about economic growth in the dictatorship, which I'm not going to talk about here. But it's very questionable. I guess we have, both in Chile and in the world, we have experienced like a kind of propaganda about the Chilean miracle. I think it's good to put it like more to the ground, see the numbers, and well, you can judge. So I will focus especially in inequality and economic insecurity in Chile. So the first question I got from fellow economists in the department was, what's going on in Chile? How is possible that such a successful economy is having those kind of troubles? So basically all the set of policies in Chile have been used as an example for other countries, and it was also hard to explain why, for me, the economy was not doing so well. But I think that this is also all what's happening is at least partly showing that we were not doing that well. So I think to answer this question, one has to question whether is that true, that inequality was decreasing. Some people have said that inequality is decreasing. I'm going to show you why. And what does it mean to not be poor in Chile? Okay. And then move on to why do people mobilize. So it's not that people look at the Gini index in the morning and they decide, okay, I'm going to go to the street. I think things are a bit different. And it's so about inequality. This is the graph that I think even at the ex-Ministry of Finance in Chile, I think, look, when he was writing a column like last week, when he said that the inequality was falling. I guess many economists tend to look at this because it's the most popular index. This is just a measure of inequality, and we see that it's falling since the 1990 till the last measure we have. Let's take it as given. So let's look at what's happening in the neighborhood. This is what's happening in all Latin American countries. In red is the Gini index for Chile. So we see that in most Latin American countries, the Gini index is falling down, especially after the 2000s. And yeah, if we believe in this measure, before we were closer to Brazil, one of the most unequal countries in the world, and now we're like in the middle of South America, which is also one of the most unequal regions in the world. Like 15 years, in the 2000s, I think, Chile became part of the OECD, and our governors were very proud of it because we're becoming part of the developed world. And this is how the Gini index look when compared to OECD countries. So we are in the far right with a high of the graph, with a high Gini index. And you may say, okay, this is an unfair comparison. You're comparing it with, I don't know, welfare societies, blah, blah, so on. When one plots the Gini index against the PIB per capita, one sees that if we look at those countries that have more or less the same GDP per capita, Chile is at the top. So it's still, even comparing to countries with similar GDP, we have a very high Gini index, assuming that this is a good measure. Why I'm saying that? Because there are other measures of inequality, and just to show one. This is the share of the national income that goes to the top 1%. And we see in this figure that it's not clear that it's falling. Okay. No, I mean it could be increasing, but at least it's not falling. That's what I think the graph is trying to show, and this is around 20%. So around 20 or 20 something percent of the national income goes to the top 1%. So, and this is how this looks like, to have a sense of what does this mean in comparing different groups of society. So this is the data from Fundación Sol, and based on a study about the top 1% and data from the National Household Survey. So this is for 2013. If we take the bottom 50% of the income distribution, the average income is without transfers from the government, just what families can make from their work. It's a bit less than $400. The top 1% gets in average per person monthly $42,000, according to this data. And well, the difference gets more obscene when it goes to the 0.1 and 0.01. Okay. Well, you can also take a look at how many people is that we are talking about. So I guess what this part about inequality wants to say is, first, it's not clear that inequality has been falling, as some have said, even like just statistically, just looking at the numbers, and inequality is still super high. So then I would like to talk about the poverty rate. So another argument that has been given is that how is this happening in a country where poverty rate is falling? And in this case, I couldn't tell the opposite. Whatever poverty line you use, or among the standard, this is just the standard measures, poverty rate is falling. But I think it's useful to discuss what it means to live above the poverty line in Chile. So this is in 2015, Fundación Sol. Well, what happened is, well, always after the household service, the governments are happy to tell that the poverty rate is falling down. So the official rate was 11.7% in 2015. So they did the following exercise. They said, okay, for the second row, let's take out subsidies and transfers to see how much money is really making people is really making, like from their work. So then the poverty rate increases till 15%. Then what it's striking is that when you own your house, when people does these calculations, if you are the house owner, you don't have to pay rent, so they assume that you have like an implicit income. So what they did was, okay, let's take out that imputed rent, imputed income. And the poverty rate increases to almost 27%. Then the poverty line is created based on consumption basket. So they said, okay, let's consider a quality food basket designed by the health ministry. They did that, and all these calculations in the middle, the corresponding calculations in the middle, and the poverty rate goes to 40%. So regardless of how if we can compare these to other countries or not, I think what this number suggests is that there is a lot of people above the poverty line, which is not necessarily in the best economic conditions. So another way to look at this is survey data from 2018. 50% of workers made less than that number, $988. With that poverty line, it means that 50% of the workers make a monthly wage that is below the poverty line for a family of four. Our minimum wage is $682. So there is a lot of people that is making between the minimum wage and slightly above. not surprisingly, when one looks at how indebted are households in Chile, the survey, it says that in 2017, 66% of households were indebted. Well, that is not necessarily bad if this is, I don't know, this is what some people may say. If you're investing in education, you're investing in your house or whatever. But when one looks at for the debt for consumption, it's 55% of the households are indebted for consumption. So this is not sufficient to say that this is but this is at least suggestive of that the situation of a lot of people that is living above the poverty line or around the median income is not great. Also, this is numbers about pensions. According to Fundación Sol, in 2019, 50% of the new retired men self-finance a pension below $311, and 1,500 of new retired women self-finance a pension below 88. The basic solidarity pension, the one that gives the state, if you don't have any right to access to the private system, is that amount $265. So I guess my point here is if one wants to look at the economic causes, I think here is one we have to. It's not only about who is below the poverty rate, but that big mass of people that is might be 70 or 70% of the population that has uncertainty, and for example about how it's gonna live after they retire. Okay, so. But as I said before, I think that people doesn't look at the Gini index before going to the street. So I would like just some ideas about what might be happening also from an economic perspective. So during the last decades, we've seen a lot of social movements around issues of education, health, pensions, and so people is getting to, I think, we're getting to think about these things as social rights and not mere goods of consumption. So this idea of education, health, and pension being social rights is extremely at odds with the system in Chile. For its intention, for example, with extreme inequality in the quality and the access to the services. This is strongly based on your ability to pay, which in Chile means basically where you were born. And at the same time, many of these services that we can consider as social rights are provided by the private sector and often for-profit private companies. One extreme example is the water property rights. To use water in Chile, the river's water, you have to pay people that has its property. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only country in the world that happens. So if we think that access to water is a human right, we're in problem because our constitution strongly protects the private property rights, and at least this is in intention. At the same time, we experience like weakening of trust in institutions. We've seen cases of corruption and conflict of interest in the armed forces, in the police, in the government, in the Congress, and political parties. We have seen also that in the private sector, this is just an example, anti-competitive practices in the case of pharmacies, which is strongly at odds with the idea of health being a social right. And it seems that the elite can get away with crime, so that basically I think this is my interpretation, that the punishment for this kind of high class crimes are low, at least, or unfair. So basically, we have an elite that is far from people's reality. And for some of you, if you are following the news the last weeks and even before the massive protests started, we had, for example, a government officer saying that the increase in the, given that the fare of the public transport was increasing, this was an opportunity to incentivize people to wake up early or something like that, the people should wake up early. So I think this is also a battle for dignity. So people is tired of this. So just to finish, people is not protesting for the Gini index. I think they are protesting for economic safety and economic justice. And economic safety in the sense of, if I'm working all the hours that I have to work, if I'm working honestly, why I don't have access to the most basic things? And this interacting with economic justice, when it's striking when, I guess, that for people that it's in that situation to see that those things that are supposed to be social rights are extremely unequally distributed. I think that's it. Thank you.
Did I send you the PowerPoint? Okay. Do you have the PowerPoint? Yeah. Okay. ¿Está aquí?
En el escritorio.
Pero no. Okay. Just one second.
¿No es ese?
No, no. ¿Cómo ahora acá? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, you can all see my password. Oh, but I need to go on to slides.
Just go into your drive.
Yeah, no slides. Sorry.
No.
Maybe I forgot to send that to you. I think that might have happened.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to see such a full room. Well, Kate already introduced me. I'm a student here. I would like to start by saying that I am not discussing this issue from a academic or scholarly point of view. It's very much grounded on my own experience as someone who was educated in the public school system. I attended a high school that was very much at the center of student organizing during the 2011 student movement and beyond, and that has been a very important part of my political education, and I'm very much trying to understand the current political moment in Chile from that point of view and understanding what the legacies of social movements, but particularly the 2011 Chilean student movement, are for understanding the situation we're living today. So I think, as Kate already mentioned, when we were starting to think about this event, we were trying to go against this idea that no one could have predicted this moment, that no one could have predicted that 1.5 million people would take to the streets in Santiago to protest the current economic and political system. What I would say to those people is that maybe they haven't been paying enough attention, beginning with, I think, particularly the 2006 Revolución Pingüina, or Penguin Revolution, because of the uniform students wear. Moving into pretty much 15 years of protest around different social rights. As you can see in the non-exhaustive list that I have put up, I would like to say that obviously this list does not encompass of the political struggle of the Mapuche people have been experiencing, or indigenous people throughout centuries. And although I won't be referring specifically to the state violence and state terrorism that our indigenous people have lived through, I think it's very important that we keep them in mind as we continue to try to think of this political moment. So, as we have heard before, or perhaps some of us have seen on the media, the protest began on October 18th with a call made by secondary students across Santiago to evade the metro fare as a way of protesting for the rise in the prices. That although it did not affect students themselves, it affected their parents and their neighbors and kind of began this call for action. That is why I think it's so important to talk and look back at the legacies that the student movement has had in Chilean society, because students particularly have had a very important role in pushing the rhetoric forward and opening spaces for political contention in this democratic period. And this is a picture from the first day of protests that, as we know, became horribly repressed by the special forces, leading eventually to the state of exception in Santiago and across the country later on. So what was the Chilean student movement of 2011? Even before I can start talking about that, I think it's very important to think about what is the root of the education crisis that this movement is responding to. I would very much like to talk to you about this for hours, but it's not possible. So I think something that is very important to understand is that there are 4 pillars to the commercialization or mercantilization of education within this neoliberal model that José has already been talking to us about. I think at the core is the system of municipalization, or this idea that states are no longer run by, schools are not longer run by the state, but are instead run by municipalities. What does that mean in practice, considering the levels of income inequality that we have across the capital and the country, is that schools with increased funds have better education, both in terms of the quality of education as well as the infrastructures and different resources that are available to students. So this creates segregation, inequality in access, and lack of quality in schools since the primary level moving forward. So this inequality that students live through since the moment they're put into the education system, and that is very hard to escape from. Another heritage of this economic model that becomes translated into education is the self-financing system for universities. So under the Constitution of 1980 and the laws that came afterwards, what the government does is it kind of separates itself from a provider of education and a regulator of education to just sort of a small financer within a broader system that is very much led by the funds provided by families and students themselves. So this means that even traditional state schools like Universidad de Chile and other universities across the country have to increasingly rely on tuition funds in order to keep running. The state does no longer finance that system as it used to. What this leads is for the proliferation of private for-profit actors, both beginning with the primary and secondary school system, but increasingly universities. And the Constitution of that time also gets rid of quality checks on all of these institutions. So you have a proliferation of schools and universities with very little checks in quality for students. And finally, debt as a precondition to access post-secondary education. That is very much built into this all other system, but it becomes increasingly strong during the democratic period with the creation of the Crédito con Aval del Estado, which kind of dislinks the state from providing loans to students and instead supports students in asking loans from private banks, in simple terms. So I think the takeaway from these things, I know that was a lot of information, is that education is at the core of sustaining the inequality that we see taking place in Chile and that we've already seen the proof of with José's comments. So the student protest began in April 2011 over a very small conflict about delaying government funds, but it very soon escalated into mass articulation of demands regarding the high cost of education, the proliferation of for-profit within the system, the lack of quality, and the segregation of the system. Specifically, the protests that spread across the nation gathered the Chilean youth behind three main demands: high-quality free education, demunicipalization of secondary schools, and an end to the for-profit education system. And then, I think the beginning point of this movement is with June 16 in La Marcha de los 100,000, the March of the 100,000s, which now seems like a very tiny march compared to what we're seeing. But at that point, it was really a turning point on social mobilization in the democratic period. It's something that had not been seen before, and that spread not only in Santiago, but across the country. But what does this movement look like in practice? I would like to talk to you about the three core forms of organizing that students used, both secondary students and university students used at the time. One of them are marchas, which are pretty self-explanatory. I think it's important to understand that in 2011, these were weekly events. People were taking to the streets every week, nonstop, and it was an important form of continuing to articulate that the students were strong, that they were going to keep on protesting until they were heard. And the government increasingly restricted, for example, the routes to push students to less visible areas of the city, arguing for the need to protect private property and Santiago's traffic flow, but also as a way to increasingly push away the cause of the students from taking space in the public and disrupting the everyday life of this city. The second form of organizing, which is very important and was very prevalent throughout the movement, are tomas, which you can kind of see in this image. This is a high school in Providencia, a traditional male high school in Providencia, José Victorino Las Tarrias. And tomas are literally takeovers of schools by their students. So effectively, the purpose is to stop school instruction as students block entrances to the school and keep the school occupied at all times of the day. This means that students are sleeping at the school. By doing so, the financing system through vouchers based on school attendance is completely interrupted, and the hope is that this will put pressure on municipal but also state administrators in order to sit down and have a dialogue with students and concede to students' demands. But this didn't happen in 2011. And at the same time, because of this, given how long many of this occupation lasted, for example, the occupation of my school lasted 9 months through 2011, different commitments and formal organizing were required in order to continue the legitimacy of the movement. So within these tomas, you had spaces for political discussion and education, but also daily assemblies in order to continue to study the demands of the movement and also to evaluate the state responses and the different steps that students were taking, both in dialogue, particularly with university students who were also part of these tomas, to continue the movement. And that was, in many ways, a way to respond to the way that mass media and the government wanted to make these occupations into a space of disorder, a space of chaos. To give you an example, my school, which is still is, an only girls' school, and that was in Toma for 9 months, was often called a puterío, a whorehouse by prominent politicians within the country. So there's obviously these two forms of discourse of trying to organize political action and trying to continue to build up legitimacy for the movement, as opposed to this increased criminalization of these forms of protest. And the last form of protesting that was also really important were the flash mobs, or sort of cultural interventions that happened throughout this time and that were very much unseen as ways of protest in the context of Chile. And you can see the big picture over there of the Thriller por la Educación, the Michael Jackson's Thriller for Education. And this was inspired. This inspired more than 200 medical students to dress up as zombies and perform a choreographed dance routine in front of the presidential palace in downtown Santiago as a way to kind of visualize these claims of a dying education system, dying in debt, and different other things. There were also things like 1800 horas por la educación, where people ran for 1,800 hours around the presidential palace in order to visualize this idea that it would require the government $1,800 million to create a free and quality education for all Chileans. So all of these forms of different forms of protest beyond what we had seen before were used in order to continue to build legitimacy in a movement that dragged on not only for 2011 but for several years. And why am I telling you all of this? Why am I telling you all of this, and why am I telling it to you now if this was actually kind of almost 10 years ago? I think there are important relationships to make around the way that people are manifesting today and the current events that we're seeing and the forms of political organizing that emerged from the Chilean student movement and that didn't stay only within schools and universities but became expanded to all Chileans across the country. This was a conversation that many of us had to have with our families. You have to think that many of the people participating in the movements were minors who had to ask their parents for permission to go out for a march. And that meant that there was a bargaining and a back and forth with families that completely kind of shifted the discussion that we were having as a country. So one that's pretty self-explanatory is the effect of taking back public space and the degree to which students manifested in all spheres of society in order to call attention for the demands. And that's something. So when you're looking at the movement today, in October, several years later, you understand how people are able to organize so quickly because these methods have existed in the political consciousness for several years. People know how to organize, people know how to disperse, people know how to take care of each other in very difficult, repressive environments. And I think that's one of the very important heritages of the Chilean student movement. I think the second big effect, which I think José already touched upon very importantly, is this sort of inclusion of a universal rights language that goes against market rhetoric. So, and I think this is the particular shift from early movements, particularly the 2006 student movement, that kind of sought to leverage with the government and change laws and build other concessions to a complete shift in discourse that says, you know, like, education is not a consumption right, as the president wanted to say back then, but it is a social right. And that, in that sense, that claim allows for a proliferation of very different forms of discourse and demands. I mean, at the same time as you have claims for free education that builds up legitimacy for claims to fiscal reform, to the nationalization of copper, Chile's biggest export, among others. And it is the first time, for example, in Chile's history post-dictatorship that people start talking about a constitutional assembly. People start talking about different methods to completely shift the way that we're talking about what we deserve as citizens. And I think, again, the way that people are being to articulate these complex demands to power without a clear organization, without organizing behind a political party like you're seeing it today, since October 18, is because the discourse already exists and people have already had these conversations for several years to reach the point that we've reached today, which is, you know, we have to get away with the whole system. This is about human dignity. This is about life with dignity. And finally, I think it's this sort of shift towards extra-institutional spaces. So people are not interested in a representative democracy anymore. So as I was saying, a lot of the movement in 2011 was articulated from Thomas and from different spaces that were very separatist and that were not necessarily interested in sitting down with the president anymore, especially because as the movement had progressed, those talks had consistently fallen through. So new spaces are created, like cabildos, which are proliferating today a lot in the context of thinking about a new political project, assemblies, popular assemblies based on the territory that you live, etc. And I think this was created by the student movement, but it was also in many ways enabled by the very same policies that the government had put in place, specifically sort of the turn to make voting way less important. So Chile transitioned to like voluntary voting system, and since then I think there's been a complete sort of falling out of electoral democracy as a space to make things happen. And I think that this is very important to continue to think about how the mobilization today in Chile is going to progress, because people are disillusioned with the system, are disillusioned with the president, but also with the parliamentaries, and they're going to continue to push to create new spaces for political discourse. Yeah.
Hello again. Well, so I'm alone here. It's been very hard for everybody these last 22 days. We have been in the street protesting every day, and the feeling is very strong. The violence is strong. So I wrote a text to order the ideas. If you don't understand a word or idea, feel free to ask me, okay? So I'm a feminist, and I'm going to talking about that. The battle over women's bodies, feminist movement and resistance. They don't protect us, they rape us. A slogan from the social protest that refers to the sexual violence used by the police and the armed force against women. 22 days after the protest erupt over a 30 peso increase in the cost of subway fares. On Friday, November 8, Chilean feminist movement called for people to take the street in Santiago, Valparaíso, and each region is with historic takeover of universities were held last year to protest against gender-based abuse. The political force of the March 8 strike, known as 8M, the Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, is now being coordinated with other organizations and residents who are holding political dialogue meant to create a new Chile. Feminist movements are fighting on various fronts, putting their bodies on the line for the movement that is developing in Chile. November 8 was the first time that people were called to take to the street so that feminists demand will never again be relegated to the background. The 8M feminist coordinating body, la Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, which was formed to organize the international strike that has been held every March 8 since 2017, called for a march and a day of plurinational feminist and dissident protest that Chilean feminists hope will be a milestone in this effort to raise awareness of and give meaning to the crisis as they denounce the political sexual violence suffered by women, lesbian, gay men, and transgender people in our street and neighborhood. The Chilean Special Police Force have used excessive force in response to the protests, particularly the student movement. On Tuesday, November 6, students at Liceo 7, it's a public girls' school in Santiago, vote to engage in a takeover. It's a toma, who Paula talking about. Sorry, guys, I lost. The spokesperson for the National High School Student Coordinating Body, CONES, Valentina Miranda, explained that the protest was reported to the school principal and that she called the police. They shot at a group of students and injured two of them badly enough to merit a trip to emergency room. One of the girls was hit by over 20 pellets, and the other had a projectile in her thigh that doctors were unable to remove. That is the mark of the oppression that has been unleashed against high school students. The recent passage of the safe classroom law, which is designed to criminalize and stigmatize the student, struggle and increase discrimination against young people. This law allowed the administration in each school to immediately expel a student involved with any sort of political participation. A student blamed Mayor Felipe Alessandri for the repression that is taking place in school in the municipality of Santiago. Today, the common denominator is exposure to violence. They attack children, older adults, human rights observer, representative of organizations, and member of the national and international press. They no longer care that the entire territory under siege is being invaded by the sound of weapons. It isn't just Santiago. People throughout the country have been victimized in broad daylight, and they come together over shared causes through local demands have been taken center across the country, because living in the desert is different from living in Patagonia. Horrifying images circulate on social media, and the number of video and photographs continue to multiply. On November 6, Chile's president had an approval rating of just 9%. Meanwhile, a prosecutor has filed charge against 14 police officers who are accused in engaged in act of abuse, and each face 5 to 10 years in prison. But we know that there are more than 14 of them. We know that this is happening every day, and this is a systematic. Women and Gender Equality Minister Isabel Plat denied receiving complaints from women alleging that had been the victim of gender-based violence during the protest, despite the large number of complaints filed with the National Institute for Human Rights. A video that was published on Monday, November 5th, shows two female police officers being burned by a Molotov cocktail, an act that was repudiated by many groups in Chile and on social media. Some have questioned the veracity of the video and accused of them fabricating the event. In any case, it is notable that Minister Pla quietly reacted and offered her support to the women officers. In doing so, the minister rejected the existence of complaints sexual violence perpetrated by members of the military and or police, but expressed her support for injured police officers, calling into question what gender violence is when it happens. The women ministry is blind to what is happening in the street, with feminist movement with that reality have been captured by the public and disseminated around the world on social media, that government has preconceived notion of which women can be recognized and defended. Meanwhile, in the street, feminine voices are building a new country, recognize themselves as diverse and indigenous, building a powerful narrative that has also become a questioning of the symbol that hegemonic power has used to establish nationalism. Status of founding fathers have been turned down in cities throughout the country, revealing that the story that we are taught in one invasion, domination and extermination, and that the indigenous revert that is fighting against the patriarchy act as defender of the historical discrimination and criminalization of the other. These are movements that celebrate false truth and the myopic writing of a story at the service of oligarchies. Their destruction is the rebellion of the people against the state that underestimate estimate them, that systematically eliminate them from formal humanity. So, really, you understand me or not? Yes? Yeah. So I have the text here, so maybe I can send the text and can you read it to me at the same time? What do you think about that? No, that's okay? It's okay. Okay. Meanwhile, in the street, feminine voices are building a new country. Sorry, I read that. Statues, invasion, indigenous river. These are monuments that celebrate false triumph and myopic writing of a history of the service of oligarchies. Their destruction is the rebellion of the people against the state that underestimate them, that systematically eliminate them from the formal humanist, civic and philosophic education, and that sought to reduce how much history students were required to learn in order to keep the population under the thumb of the neoliberalism and technocracy, to keep them opinionless and focused on consumption to advance the great company of Chile. That state is now coming up against a people that seek out information and education and enrich dominant discourse with local and personal experience. They do so not through the formal established route, but on their own, discovering ways to organize in the process. They find this answer in the street and in assemblies and town halls, through the exchange of ideas, book generation coming together. Some read the Constitution, which is not taught in the elementary or secondary school. Its study will seem to be limited to the word of law. They are alienating ideas, creating a vision of the country they want, while repression is present in every protest and any gesture that is taken to be suspicious. But the desire for that Chile wins out over exhaustion and fear. Its mood a telluric country had been beaten down and worn out by the normalization of violence, creating a resilient and resistant people. The repression hasn't stopped. In fact, a statistic published by the National Institute of Human Rights indicate that it's increased. A group of professionals and volunteers are working independently to gather and report out complaints because no one has any confidence in the state institution. The feminist attorneys of Chile have begun to work with the Universidad de Chile Student Federation, a law student center, as well as a Fundación Casa Común. The change that Chile experiences is profound. It's not merely a matter of pride, it is also one of pain. Everything is being questioned and resignified through opinion pieces, audiovisual records, art action, and other cultural artifacts that advance ideas and strengthen citizens' demands. The 8M coordinate body, la Coordinadora 8 de Marzo, has become a space that brings together various social and political organizations and identities that work together to take action and participate in all aspects of the social movement. It promotes coming together, dialogue, and collective action among various organizations in order to advance and share agenda rooted in feminism against the precarity of life. They show the rejection of the government violence, which segregate and choose who to protect, and wasn't shown in the case of one female police officer. One of the enriching aspects of this feminist movement has been its ability to have women self-select as a participant and empower women without leaders based on its brand of collective leadership and communion. They have categorically denounced the human rights violation and abuse through performance and public action that make state gender violence visible. A few days ago, they made their position regarding the movement public, rejecting any negotiation with those who have declared wars against the people. They reject any accommodation for the impunity and have called for the president to resign. They have declared themselves autonomous and independent from political parties in order to prevent feminists from being instrumentalized. Feminists engage in many forms of activism, some of which take up symbols of resistance to the dictatorship. These include a national dance in Chile. It's called the cueca. It's called la cueca sola or cueca alone. Is a member of the relative of the detained and disappeared during the dictatorship. The women dance a lot with a photo of the disappeared related pinned on their chest. There are also other action and performance focused on human rights. There are violent times, and there is an urgent need to use the body to send a message, to engage immediately. Ephemeral action to denounce abuse. Performance has become an artistic tool of activism. The lack of response to gender violence have led women to use their bodies to speak out against impunity. In one case, women spell out the word rapist with funeral flower arrangement, while others lifted their clothing to put their bodies on display. Thousands of women participate in the Silent Women in Mourning March, a broad call to action that ended at La Moneda, the presidential palace, with the singing of a song that recalled the macabre years of the dictatorship and his torture and murder, and that had recently been rewritten to once again demand our right to live in peace. The women called for justice, for rejecting impunity. Many women marched with a patch over one eye in honor of the women who have been left partially or completely blind. A portrait of a state punishment that keeps us from seeing, from living our dream and try to silence our struggle and awakening. Chile's body territory displayed his trauma. While in Argentina there was a discussion of legal, safe, and free abortion, Chile created that Feminist May of 2018, also known as a feminist wave, a fourth, which brought together the largest number of women in the history of our country. Today they are also in the street. While Chilean feminist movement date back more than a century, those closest to this wave are the movement of women influenced by Ni Una Menos, Not What Less, and Me Too. They also organize around the case of Nabila Rifo, a woman who was brutally beaten, blinded, and left for dead by her former partner. The treatment of the case in the press and the court outraged the country. As a feminist, we reject gender violence as an spectacle to which we are subjected by the state, and the exposure and questioning of private life that re-victimize us and blame us for the violence to which we are subjected. Thank you. So I think that's it. Is everything for the moment. This is developing now, so I don't know when they've been end, but because of that, I wrote that text or paper. So there's so many things happening in this moment. The people is in the street every day, so it's really hard for us. So thank you for listening. listen. And so I don't know if you have any question.
Kate said that I guess we can open up questions now for anyone on the panel, and she's going to be handing out the microphone.
I'm going to bring a microphone to the people who raise their hands so that Pamela can hear and the folks watching the live stream can hear as well.
I don't hear really well. This is too loud here.
Okay, we'll work on that.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, right now it's okay.
But we want to make sure that
When
you
I
can
say
hear the
we, I
questions.
mean other people, not me.
Okay. Anybody? Questions?
Thanks to all of you. I really learned a lot as someone who is only kind of following things through the news. I really appreciated all of your perspectives. And I feel like I learned a lot about kind of what's driving the protests and what's driving people to go out on the streets and the different kinds of strategies that are being employed. So I was curious, and this is a question, I guess, to whoever wants to answer or can answer. Where are the sort of social bases of reaction? What are the kinds of groups that are sympathetic to the protesters, but that the state can maybe win back to their side, other than the police and security forces, of course, but I guess more the social forces, and what kinds of bargains is the state willing to make with them, or would they be willing to accept to kind of shift their sympathies from the demonstrators to the state?
Anyone want to take that on?
Is this on? Okay. I don't know if there's anyone who will sit down with this government. I think I think actually what we see is that people continue to kind of talk to the government, particularly Piñera, on the streets and with the kind of things that are getting voiced in the streets. I mean, obviously the biggest call being for him to quit. He has said that he's not going to quit. He told the BBC in an exclusive interview where he also lied and said that he had been in the protests against his government. I think what it is dangerous of this process of like this government is so delegitimized that no one will sit at the table with them is that the sort of argument will turn to the streets, and what we have seen developing, or what at least we've observed, is that there's sort of calls, particularly from the more extreme right that's at the government, to call for citizens themselves to kind of argue with protesters on the streets. So there's something that's currently kind of being developed, which is the yellow vest groups, los chalecos amarillos, which are sort of far-right, very privileged citizens who are sort of taking to the streets with guns or with bats to kind of dissuade protesters and protect their property. Obviously, that being one of the core sort of building pillars of our constitution. I think kind of where I see most of the discussion taking place now is there. And that is in itself dangerous, because it's all about sort of physical violence in order to quiet one side down. Yeah, I don't know if Pamela, there's something you want to say.
The way I see it, I think the country is divided into visions. The people who support the mobilization, the violence, they want a change, a real change, and the people who want to keep it's like the chaleco amarillo, or it's focused in the material things, like a supermarket and houses and that kind of stuff. So it's very clear the line which divide the idea. It's like a human right for one side, and the other side is a materialist thing. everybody feels these two sides of the one. The chalecos amarillos is one expression for that, but the meaning, the difference between one and another is like a social movement which focus in dignity and human rights and being a better society. And the other one is like a material things, like the economy is broke too. No, I don't know, but it's a supermarket and malls and that. I think this is in simple words that a very common idea for the both sides.
Actually, can Pamela or Paula, can someone speak to how extensive the Chalecos Amarillos movement is? Like, is this a small group of folks? What does it represent?
I would say it's a very small group, but I think Pamela, who's there, is probably more able to speak to that.
I don't know. I'm in the museum. But I think it's not rich people. It's like a media class. I don't know the word, but in Spanish is aspiracional. That kind of people. And so they start at a small group, but now is bigger. I think the case of John Cobin, you know what happened? Yeah. Is sorry, I can't hear you.
You can tell everybody though.
Okay. I will try. It's American guy who live in Chile since, I don't know, 10 years. Is a supremacist, a white supremacist, and he believes in the economy, neoliberal, a lot. And he's mad. So he was in the street. They're going in a city who has a beach and going in her car, and in a moment it's been a protest there, and they pull your gun out and shoot the people. That's it. And he goes. And later he video grabó. Recorded a video, tell to the people why he did that, because the people want to hear him o violentarlo, querían hacerle algo. So this is the kind of people who use the chalecos amarillos. It's everybody. No, some people laughing about that, but I think it's very dangerous movement, because they have guns and bat the baseball. They promote the violence in the street, and they don't have a perspective what they happen. Also, this is a story from my friends. I don't know, a few days ago, there's been a protest in Costanera Center, you know, the mall, the super mall we have here. This is a symbol of the neoliberal economy. And well, there's a lot of people there. It's like I don't know, 3,000 personas, like that. And they came, the chalecos amarillos, only for protect the material things represent that symbol. So I don't know what happened, how it was developed that, but I think it's like, so it's very similar what happened in the United States about the supremacist movement. There are many Argentinos, Latinos in this logic about national thinking. So I think it's what was that.
Thank you.
Hello. Yes. Okay. Thank you all so much. I think it was you all had like really wonderful presentations. I think something that's interesting is that this is definitely, we had not seen like popular mobilization in this scale in Chile for decades, right? Partly because of the legacies of the dictatorship, and the people who are leading these protests, who have seemed to be on the vanguard, are the feminists and the students who've been moving for the past couple years and have experience with. I don't know if this is working. Is this working? Yes. Who like are maybe leading the way in terms of like creative protest practices and taking over public spaces and holding cabildos, and I'm interested in what the connection of those movements are to other movements in Chile, like to say the labor movement or the peasant movement, maybe like how much are they connected to each other? Where are there areas of tension in terms of thinking about protest strategy and the demands? Where are there areas for like collaboration that haven't been explored? If any of you have like thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Can I?
Please.
I don't know the answer, but I just wanted to say that there are many Chilean folks here. So if you guys want to also share your, you maybe you want to take the questions and give the answers. We are all from here from abroad trying to understand what's going on. So please feel free also to
jump
make an intervention or whatever.
Yeah, does anyone want to take that one on? The question of the relationship, is this working? Between feminist and student movements and other traditional like movements in Chile, and sort of points of collaboration or discord potentially?
Oh, I want to make a question.
Oh, okay. Pamela, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, but it's difficult for me talking in English about that, but I will try. So maybe some words in Spanish. I think we are all in this together. That's it. But I think yes, it's like a media class movement. I think it's that. It's not a difference between. I feel that way. Don't look like that. I feel that way because I'm displayed. No, so the other in front of you. No, it's a joke. No, I think that they're working in some, maybe the sindicatos, they're working together. So that is a fact. Tomorrow is the national strike, and we are all in this together. The transport will stop, and the productive companies are stopped. I don't know if the metro stopped, but maybe too. No one to go to her jobs. Tomorrow we have a sindicato here, and we're going to strike too. And I don't know if the rural areas are being in this. I think this is a global movement in the country, but I think it's like more class media movement and popular neighborhood too. But I don't know. I don't know if a working is connect this work. I think the sindicatos are together in this. I don't know, they translate the colegios. It's like a professional association.
Yep.
You know what that means? Yeah, the colegio, like a doctor, architect, every colegios are together to Metro. Metro was a symbol very important for us because it start there, and the syndicate of Metro has talking a lot about montaje. Montage.
Set up.
I think the media montage about the fire in the station and the carros, about what happened in this place. Sorry if I don't answer the question.
Where's the
Just to add something to that, because it was about like movement, and just to say that to what you were saying before, the main issue is that in Chile, the idea of movement, the idea of a peasant movement, that kind of things are really weakened. So there is no identity that comes from that level. We can find movement, for example, in the Mapuche,
Yes, of
in
course,
the south. But for example, right now the Mapuche are really quiet, as they could be the perfect scapegoat. If they go out, it will be all against them, because they have been the target of the internal like security, like the kind of the perfect terrorist target always. And in regards to unions, unions have been weakened for a long time, but one of the projects since the late 2000s have been to revive unions, and that has been tested now. They were present in 2011, and now the main issue is to coordinate union actions. So we see, for example, in ports are very active, but then the miners are really hard to get out because miners operate in a different economy. So that's the other thing, that Chile has different speed economies. So we have the agricultural sector where there is no really much organizing, and then we have the mines that operate really internationally. So that has been the main challenge for a national movement, and that's why these identities are more diffuse, and schools are a perfect place for this type of organizing, because in schools we see like kids from many sectors coming together, and their parents create like the sense of solidarity is created by like this shared space where all these kids are. So I think that's why these other spaces are more optimal for these movements. So that's why I would agree.
Just a quick other thing I wanted to add as regards like political parties and their involvement in this. Like we've had socialist presidents in the last 20 years. We've had the Communist Party is still active and well, and at least my experience being a part of the student movement in more like 2012, 2013, was that frequently within student organizing bodies, you had like the communist youth infiltrate those movements and try and recruit people to their parties, and oftentimes take over decentralized, depoliticized movements, or depolitical party movements. And I would say that there's a really big disillusionment with these parties that come from even before, again, this time that then were shut down during the dictatorship, came back post-dictatorship, but because they haven't been able to change the constitution, because we still live under the regime that was imposed by the dictatorship, these political parties are incredibly disenfranchised and institutionalized. So we've had socialist presidents who've done nothing to nationalize resources or to act on anything that you would think is socialist. And so I would say that the movement as well on the political party end of things is pretty disaffiliated, which is really inspiring, I think, on the level that it's a very decentralized movement, like people have been saying, with no leaders, very few spokespeople, But I also know that speaking with friends from what happened with the feminist movement last year, there was a lot of frustration around the fact that the feminist movement started out as incredibly decentralized and self-organized, and there's also what they call the dissidents, which is basically the queer movement, that has also been organizing its own cabildos, these like popular discussions, roundtables, and assemblies. And what happened with the feminist movement on some level was that as it became more self-institutionalized, as it had to organize in order to like remain the same, or in order to prolong the movement, they ended up falling into institutional systems that they at first rejected. So at first they had like rotating speakers and no leaders, and then as the press pressured them to have stationary speakers and things, like they ended up getting leaders, and that sort of disbanded the movement because it was going against what they had initially set out to do, which was push back on patriarchal forms of organization and power. So it's really difficult because there are people trying to, in many ways, create systems that are anti-systemic, and oftentimes they find these things undoing themselves as well.
Yeah, thanks. Piñera announced yesterday that he agrees that Chile needs a new constitution. What are the perspectives of this possible constituent process? And what about during the last Bachelet term, there were a public consultation, a kind of bottom-up process. Why this process was not successful to give a new constitution to Chile?
Does anybody want to take that on?
I can speak a little bit to the best of my ability about sort of the constitutional process that it's kind of being spoken about now. So as the system is set up, the Senate doesn't necessarily have the power to modify the whole constitution. So that has been and there was a discussion that was coming up in the Constitution Commission, I think maybe today, about that, that people were kind of also trying to educate themselves about, because there was the fear that sort of this process would kind of be branded as a constitutional change that would only sort of modify very specific articles and would probably keep the structure intact. What I think the only solution or the only path for the real call to change the constitution is for the parliament to call for a plebiscite on consulting whether the constitution is to be changed. Because that's the power that the parliament has in order to then move to a constitutional process. And that would hopefully require a vote on whether a constitutional assembly should be created, which is a completely different process than articulating this change within the political establishment. Because an constitutional assembly would mean that perhaps it is a system between a mixed committee of civil society members and parliamentaries, or a group that is completely constituted of civil society actors. And obviously, it's hard to sort of bargain with the parliament in this way because there isn't a clear set of demands of what the constitutional process should look like from the citizens. But I think it's important to understand that the process that Piñera is pushing now, it sort of could be pretty much a cosmetic change to the constitution that we have now, which is sort of the change that have been made in the past under also left-leaning governments. Yes.
Sorry, a little thing about that. Can you hear me?
Please.
Yeah.
Piñera has 9%. It's nothing. Because of that, he don't want to change nothing. The people want now the plebiscite, no the Congress, Constitutional Congress, no. O sea, everybody talk about that today and tomorrow. The plebiscite, the 15, December 15, is the answer for the people, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for all your presentations. You spoke earlier about, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Me?
Yeah.
Paula.
Paula, thank you. Paula, you spoke earlier about people caring for each other in the tomas, and I imagine also with the national strike, there's sort of a lot of mutual support that emerges in these moments. And I'd just love to hear more about how are people caring for each other, feeding each other in these moments.
I think like one of the things that at least keeps me sane in this process is to see like the different forms of care that people display in the streets. And I'm sure like so many of us Chileans in the audience can speak to that too. I think back in the Chilean student movement, it was an issue of like knowing your rights and people talking to each other about their rights and how to take care of each other in very sometimes like kind of practical ways. Like everyone knows that when you're being arrested, you sort of scream your name and you scream your ID number, your root, as a form of protection, as a form for people to know that you're being detained. And now I think that's spreading even more with the use of social media that has been at the core of the movement of like videos get posted immediately after to kind of say this person has been detained in this corner, like spread the word so families can know and can go find this person. Because obviously we are existing in the fear that we have a history of disappearances, and a lot of people in the earlier days of the mobilization beginning in October were disappearing and no one knew where they had been detained and what was going on and what they were being charged for. So I think that is a very like practical way of caring. I think there are other forms that are more about sort of people putting together ollas comunes, or like this initiative of like tomar el fresco, or like people gathering in their neighborhoods and hanging out in the street and talking and holding each other in a time that I can only imagine from outside has been incredibly terrifying and hurtful. So I think people are constantly creating new ways to support each other and to hear each other. I don't know if that answers your question.
You want to say something about that? I think the thing about the eyes is been really emblematic in the street. The people buy these glasses, and they have they have a water with bicarbonato, and everybody has a pañuelo. So this is this is our uniform now. That's it. This is our uniform. Glasses,
Bandana.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
or no?
Bandanas, the masks on their faces.
Yes.
Yes.
How do you say?
Like a bandana on their face.
Like a bandana. Yes, that's it. Yeah, bandana. Water with bicarbonato, and lemon. This is the language. I don't know what is the word, but it's common in everybody. Everybody use that for being in the street, and that they say your name when the police force arrest you, and or say or levantar los brazos. How do you say that?
To raise your arms.
Raise your arm when military take your atapunta with a gun. So this is or the people in cabildos, for example, take your hands, and when is okay with the things we are developed many forms of recognize with the situation, which is every day. No, I answered the question. I don't know,
Yeah.
but
Thank you. So we have another about 15 minutes. So we definitely have time for a few more questions. If folks have questions.
Hi. Thank you once again to everyone for your presentations and for your time here. I was wondering, going back to the topic of the Constitution, first of all, whether there were certain bodies or organizations or groups of people who have been taking charge in determining what sorts of changes people want to be made to the Constitution, but also was curious as to how maybe social media and technologies have been sort of or helping or influencing the process. Like I've heard of like chilegracia.org and like sort of the this idea of like further democratizing like the process through use of like media and such. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to that a bit.
And I think this is one that folks in the audience can certainly answer.
So as of like this last week, at the end of last week, people started really calling for these cabildos, and I just looked up a translation that's town hall-ish, so sort of like local town halls. And so there are even ones being organized in the States, but basically all across the country, people are organizing like small localized town halls, and there's a website that has like a form and specific questions, and it's sort of like, what do we think the essential basic right at the center of the Constitution should be, as opposed, like instead of private property, for example. What do we think the way that we should do these, like the way that we should write the new Constitution is? And so yeah, like a little bit what Paula was referring to is that there'd be first this yes or no vote, do we need to change the Constitution? And then there'd be a secondary vote with 4 options. So one is to do the Constitutional Assembly, which basically brings together a panel of experts, normal citizens and politicians, who will no longer be able to serve terms after they make the Constitution. So that would be the Constitutional Assembly. And they would work for, I think, around 2 years to write a new Constitution. And that would, I think, is the most popular option, at least on more radical ends. Then there's the one that's being proposed right now, which is a congressional constitution, to rewrite it with the current politicians that we have. Another is to just have a panel of experts who don't have a connection to the population. So like fewer people write it, which is how the current one we have was written by 4, powerful white dudes. And I can't remember what the 4th version is, but basically people are really coming up with new mechanisms, and they're just this last weekend I was watching some beautiful videos from like a queer town hall that was held where people voiced their opinions for 2 full days, sitting in a park, and then those are being like put together by sometimes organizations and sometimes just a group of people who have self-congregated, and then they'll send those responses, and sort of they're generating extra systemic forms, like Paula was saying, these extra systemic spaces of dissent and of rebuilding.
Oh, I can say something. I don't know if is that your question, but we have 2 cyber attacks. One of them to the police force, who show, it's like WikiLeaks, show every file about the intelligence and over the social leaders. And the other one is the cyber attack is to the National Human Rights National Institute, and shows this document. This information was very important to the people who really knows what happened today with the state, with the government, and I don't know if you want to know about that, but it's a technology mixed with the social movement.
Hi, it was so good. Thank you guys so much. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the narratives of violence that we've seen both in the mainstream media and in the kind of like social media, like alternative news sites, and just kind of to reiterate a little bit what happened with the violent escalation that the government created, but that if you look at the narratives in media, there's this idea of like the kind of violent subject that is the protester, and the protester is the looter, and even in the early reports Now the New York Times has changed its tune a little bit because the protests aren't going away, but the very early reports were all about like violent students like ruining the subway, you know. So I wonder if you could just like review a little bit how these narratives of violence have kind of been unfolding, and the kind of extreme response of the military and the government. And yeah, just kind of a review a little bit about what happened. It's not a good question.
I think adding on to that question, there's been, like, from talking to friends, a lot of like playing with the truth, right? Like a lot of setup and manipulation of events on the part of the government, and I think, and probably on the part of people too. I think that'd be interesting to talk about when talking about violence.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea. So the part of the narrative is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Part of it is, as we were saying, there's clearly a divide from the dictatorship times of on which side you consider yourself, and this has played out again this time. And I think the government chose the side of the people that don't want change, that feel that their private property, that the material, like as Pamela was saying, that the material concerns are more important or are as important as human rights violations. And I think that in that way, the president has been talking about war, about powerful enemy, about and even when protests, like it's shown that it's many people that are protesting. It's not just a few delinquents or whatever. They still are putting more pressure into order and security, and I have to say, like, it's a genuine fear. Like people that have the fear of looting, of fires, of protest, of not knowing if they could get to their jobs, if something will happen to their kids. Like the violence is a real fear, and so I don't blame these people for trying to keep order as the first thing. But then trying to make the argument that everyone's a looter, everyone's making fires. I think that that's a smart play from the government to keep this divide between us. Yeah.
I think something that speaks to the power that the movement has had, even if there's no intention to see it at the same table at all, is to kind of track the way that the president and the government has been speaking about this issue. Like earlier during the state of emergency, the president completely refused to answer any questions from the media, for example. And as time goes by, it's been pushed to kind of concede to these narratives, concede to the truth in many ways. I think you can see that with, in many ways, it's a shame that we've gotten to this, but like sort of an end to this like fake truth of denying human rights violations to like slowly having to acknowledge them. And I don't think that in any way they're doing justice to the violence that they've created themselves, but I think it does speak to the ways in which people have fact-checked the president constantly taken to the streets to argue against the things that he's said and that his advisors had said, and I think like we'll continue to push them further from the streets, even if they're not sitting at the table with them. I mean, a few days ago, the first thing like that the president answered to the media was saying that like he was gonna go visit people that have been hurt by the police. Whether we think that's a good thing or not, I think it does speak to kind of the power that people are having on him and how like desperate he is to hold on to his power.
And can people speak to anybody really speak to the ways in which this narrative of the violent protester obviously resonates in different ways depending on people's generation, people's experience of the like under the dictatorship, where of course like one of the central narratives there was that it was this salvation from the violence and disorder of the Allende period and represented like the reestablishing of order that was necessary for Chilean progress, right? do we see like sort of a generational divide, since this is primarily a youth movement? Do we see a generational divide in how people are experiencing, and what are the political ramifications of any generational divide?
Hi. Okay, so I just wanted to talk in my own experience that I think this is the first time I actually have seen that age difference is not really showing up. And actually that kind of violence narrative that the president set up with that amount of repression since the first day has made that the more moderate areas of the country, like this population or people that will always be like, oh yeah, we need to change things, but let's make and take like the regular path and go step by step, and like we don't need this change today. They're seeing this happening, and they're seeing that the president and the whole government is kind of not hearing it and not seeing it, or pretend that they don't see it, and that's kind of creating that these more neutral people is actually getting more mad about it or more engaged about it, and they don't necessarily are gonna defend acts of violence, but they're like, you know what? These people have right, like, there's a reason why they're doing this. Or also something that I've never seen before, which I really like, it's people trying to explain why this happened. It's like, oh, there's this phrase, this word called the lumpen, which is basically the one that goes and break things and turn things on fire, and it comes from the dictatorship, like the concept. But now it's like, well, that person grow into that because the system of our political and social context created them somehow. So it's really bad from us to be like, oh, but he's a criminal, he needs to go to prison or whatever, instead of being like, how could we can prevent these people to kind of being forced to get down to that? And then the other thing which has been happening, and it's actually interesting, that you could say that you would think all people will be more conservationists and be like, oh, let's, how do you say avalar? Like allow this type of violence about like the criminals or the violent protesters. And actually, in a shocked way, I have realized that people of my age or young people also protect some of that. Like I have seen with videos of like, I don't know, I have posted on my Facebook like a video of repression, randomly policemen hitting people with their wood stick and then letting them run. And one person posted like, oh, but I think they showed them in the TV and they were like stealing in a grocery store. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna check, like fact check this just in case. And they weren't stealing in the grocery shop, in the grocery store. But I was like, anyways, it doesn't matter what did you do. You can't be a criminal, and there's no right or no permission for the police or the military force to hit you just because. Like, you're supposed to be held, get to the justice system, and they will decide if you need to go to prison or whatever happens, you know? And you are not, like, we as citizens are not supposed to take justice in our own hands. Well, the political forces and the policemen and the military aren't supposed to do it either. So in that sense, I do think a lot of people, it's kind of understanding this violence narrative and be like, no, actually, this is not right. And I mean, I can't tell about everybody. Maybe I do live in a bubble and everybody in my bubble believes that. But I do think it's just a small percentage of the population in Chile that it's really defending these things.
I think also a reason why this happens is because with the transition to democracy that was so like aided by Pinochet and by the military forces more general, kind of there was this social pact that we will play by the rules and we will follow, and like we will transition slowly out of this period, but that the military then wouldn't return to the streets. And I think the moment that Piñera said state of emergency, military to the streets, the first time this ever happened as a response to social protest, people were like you fucked us over. Because that, like, we have pulled up with this system, we have put up with these laws on the condition that this will never happen again. And that memory is so strong, even for people like me who never grew up in dictatorship, that when that happens, you don't care anymore because you realize that you're not playing the same game. I think that was the bottom line. I think that's what I hear from people from older generations, especially like my parents, who kind of very much came to age under this transition, right? And under this like rhetoric.
So
now I in the middle of trauma. Sorry.
No, please.
This is the place when the people live the trauma, historical trauma. It's very strong for them to see what happened in Chile right now about the torture. Is really the sexual violence to the woman, for example. It's very sorry, guys. The phone ring. Sorry. Can you keep playing? No puedo hablar ahora. Ya, gracias.
Intermission.
It's very late here, so I don't know how I going home now, but okay. Thank you. Now that's it. It's many things. It's about the torture, for the police force, the center torture. You know what happened in Baquedano in metro station. So that symbols brings alive the trauma of the dictatorship. That's it.
Thank you. So
I think we're going to have to stop there.
Yeah.
But we do have a bonus video that Nico is going to be showing, if you want to stick around for another 5 minutes. And then maybe we could talk about having a cabildo here, a town hall here at Brown about this in the future. And also if you could write out your postcards to send to Pamela at the museum, that would be great as well.
Ah, great. Yeah, that will be great. I can share with you the paper if you want.
please. Yeah, and would it be possible to like have a shared document somewhere where for resources for people that came here that are interested in like things that they trust to read more on what's happening right now in English or in Spanish? Would people be willing to help put that together?
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, I
Okay.
really encourage you all to follow alternative media. Only yesterday we had an outrageous, like, fake news story that ran in the main national TV channel. So people are becoming increasingly disillusioned with the media in the country. So if you can support alternative media like what are El Interceptor or El Ciudadano or other even grassroots Instagram accounts.
Sorry, no traditional medias.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess before we turn to the video, just wanted to thank everybody, Pamela, Paula, José for coming and being, and the audience for being central parts of this discussion that will be ongoing. So thank you all.
Okay, cool, yeah, so obviously feel free to leave. I made this video in like the 3 days following the protest. It's a very visceral just reaction to what was going on and what it's like to watch it from here. It's exactly 5 minutes long. There's no graphic violence, but it's very, the audio is very violent. Cool. Could we get lights? Sweet.
gente hueona.
Thanks everyone. Thanks especially to Paula who organized this. Les quiero.